Across intellectual history, a recurring event occurs long after discovery and usually without ceremony. A framework that once organized reality begins to lose traction, not because it has been conclusively disproven, but because it no longer contains what it was built to contain. The theory remains functional in public. It continues to be taught, cited, repeated, but its authority thins. Explanations require more qualifying language. Exceptions multiply. The vocabulary stays intact while conviction decays underneath it. What follows is rarely collapse. More often it is quiet withdrawal. This pattern recurs with notable regularity. It reflects how human understanding stabilizes itself temporarily and what occurs when that stabilization becomes unsustainable. Theories do not rise solely because they are correct. They rise because they are usable. They reduce interpretive load at moments when interpretive load is high. They convert uncertainty into procedures. They allow institutions to operate without relitigating reality at every step. In that sense, a theory is not only an explanation, it is a stabilizing structure. Periods of rapid social, technological, or cultural change repeatedly produce strong theoretical commitments. Frameworks in these periods function as containment. They reduce interpretive drift. They allow people to behave as though the world has edges again. But containment accumulates strain. The tighter a theory organizes experience, the more visible its distortion becomes as anomalies increase. Abandonment rarely occurs when a theory is refuted. It occurs when the maintenance cost exceeds the stabilizing return. A dominant modern interpretation treats abandoned theories as errors corrected by progress. This framing is psychologically efficient. It preserves confidence in current frameworks by positioning past ones as naive or incomplete. The historical record complicates this. Many theories now treated as obsolete were once treated as indispensable. They did not merely explain phenomena, they organized institutions, medical practices, legal reasoning, educational systems, and moral classifications align themselves around these models. Phlogiston theory, for example, was not irrational within its historical constraints. It organized chemical observation before atomic theory existed as a usable structure. It allowed prediction, categorization, and replication. It produced operational coherence. Behaviorism did not emerge from ignorance of inner life. It emerged from methodological distrust. At a time when introspection produced inconsistent reports and unstable measurement, behaviorism offered something scarce: observability and procedural control. These theories were praised not because they were complete, but because they reduced chaos. Their later abandonment did not occur because they were useless. It occurred because their usefulness became unsustainable. Archival material from early scientific communities repeatedly shows that praise for a theory often coincided with relief rather than certainty. The tone is procedural. The ability to proceed, the ability to standardize, the ability to stop renegotiating interpretation. This language is structurally revealing. Praise was not directed at truth alone. It was directed at authorization, permission to suspend certain questions so work could continue. Once a theory grants authorization, it becomes embedded. Careers form around it. Training pipelines assume it. Professional identity begins to mirror its categories. At that point, abandonment requires more than evidence. It requires reorganization of method, identity, and institutional memory. When a theory begins to fail, it rarely fails evenly. Its predictive power may weaken in one domain, while remaining intact in another. Partial failure produces tension rather than clarity. The cost appears first as friction. Researchers qualify more aggressively. Practitioners introduce caveats. Language becomes defensive. The theory still stands, but only when handled carefully. This produces a split between public adherence and private confidence. The framework remains performatively stable while internally unstable. Over time, this destabilizes trust, not only in the theory, but in the process that produced it. In institutional environments, this instability often correlates with rigidity. Rules are enforced more strictly as justification weakens. Deviations become disruptive, not because they are incorrect, but because they expose fragility. The abandonment that follows is rarely dramatic. It resembles withdrawal. The theory stops being defended. It remains cited but is no longer extended. It becomes historical before it becomes explicitly false. Theories do more than explain phenomena. They stabilize professional identity. A person trained under a framework does not merely use it. Their attention, judgment, and intuition are shaped by its assumptions. This produces a form of cognitive alignment with the model. When the theory weakens, that alignment destabilizes, not necessarily as distress, but as disorientation in method and classification. The individual must either reconfigure their interpretive habits or reduce exposure to the instability. In practice, many reduce exposure quietly. This functions as a coherence-maintaining response. The cost is not always emotional. The cost is often epistemic: reduced certainty, reduced continuity, reduced confidence in categorical boundaries. One reason abandonment becomes quiet rather than confrontational is that institutions do not discard frameworks symmetrically. They archive them. They keep them as scaffolding. Old theories persist as terminology, as outdated training, as assumptions hiding inside procedures. The model may be officially de-emphasized while its categories remain operational. This creates a familiar distortion. A theory can be abandoned at the level of explicit belief while remaining active inside institutional habit. In these cases, what changes first is not truth status. What changes first is what the institution is willing to defend. Thomas Kuhn described paradigm shifts as episodic rupture, old frameworks replaced by new ones. The popular version of this model emphasizes overthrow. Later historical analysis often suggests a different pattern. Many paradigms did not collapse. They thinned. They lost centrality without disappearing. They remained at the margins, used cautiously, taught conditionally, reintroduced as limited tools rather than complete accounts. This contradicts the popular narrative of decisive scientific replacement. Abandonment, in practice, often avoids definitive judgment. It allows coexistence at reduced intensity. This contradicts the idea that progress requires clean substitution. Modern audiences often misinterpret abandoned theories because they encounter them stripped of function. A theory developed to reduce interpretive chaos is later evaluated solely on accuracy. Its stabilizing role is removed from consideration. The context evaporates. The theory becomes a museum object and is judged as if it was intended to be timeless. When older theories are reintroduced as cautionary tales or curiosities, the psychological necessity that produced them is no longer visible. This produces a recurring distortion in how modern frameworks are perceived. Confidence increases when the stabilizing function of older models is forgotten. The present appears immune to the same cycle because it appears more advanced, more technical, more measured. The historical record contains repeated reversals of that confidence. The failure occurs when theories are treated as timeless rather than situational. When conditional value is mistaken for permanence, abandonment is then interpreted as embarrassment rather than as a predictable structural outcome of meaning systems under strain. Abandonment destabilizes narrative continuity. It reveals that understanding is provisional not only in content, but in structure. To treat abandonment as structural rather than corrective weakens confidence in current interpretive systems. As a result, abandonment is often reframed as error correction rather than cost management. What is reduced in this reframing is not moral humility. It is structural tolerance for provisionality. The ability to treat frameworks as tools with expiry conditions rather than identities with permanence. What remains unresolved is not whether theories weaken. That pattern is documented. The unresolved tension lies in why they are praised with such certainty before they are released without ceremony. Theories stabilize action. They reduce interpretive load. They allow institutions to function. Later, they require maintenance. Qualification accumulates. Defense becomes procedural. Confidence becomes performative. Then the theory is not rejected. It is simply no longer worth defending. New frameworks will continue to be praised under the same conditions. Older ones will continue to thin under the same pressures. And the pattern will persist as long as meaning is required to hold long enough for action to be possible.